All right, so today I want to talk about how API keys work. So whether you're building your own API and you want to implement something that uses API keys for tracking people and usage, or if you're just using an API that already exists online somewhere and they want you to use an API key and you're trying to figure out how do I implement that in my website. I've got client-side, server-side code here set up with NodeJS and with client-side JS. So I'm going to go through the whole process and how all the different parts work. On my web page here, so this is the client side. What I've done is I've kind of combined two websites here. This first part for registering an API key. This is the person who has the API, whether it's you're building your API and you've got a website for people to register, or it's some other website where you're registering to use an API. That's what this is meant to implement. So we're going to go through how this works, where you would go to the website, enter an email address, and register or whatever information you needed. Maybe it's the domain. So this is the domain right here. I'm doing localhost port 5500. That's where my website is running. And this information is here for these ones. So when this website down at the bottom here, when it's using the API, we're going to use whatever domain name the request is coming from as part of the validation process. So we're going to go through the register and then we're going to use the API key down here. All right, so let's take a look at a little bit of the client side to start with. So I've got my three forms here. There's one called reg form. That's my register form. It's just asking for the email address. I've got a little response area where I'm going to show what comes back from the server, the data that comes back from the server. Then I've got a get form. This is going to get all the cheeses. My API, all it's going to do is it's going to let you add a cheese and then fetch the list of all the current cheeses. That's all it does. But it also has this little response area where when you get all the cheeses, this is going to display the JSON data. And at the bottom, my add form for adding a brand new cheese. You just enter a name, click the button, it uploads, and then you get back the data that was just added into the list of cheeses. Okay, DOM content loaded. When the page first loads, I'm just adding the click listener to the three buttons. I have one global variable called current form, and I'm using this to track which form was just submitted. I want that because fetching data or submitting data to a form is an asynchronous thing. I don't know when that's going to come back, and my code's going to be off in a different function when that result comes back. So one function right here for handling the submit, and I'm recording the fact of which one of the buttons was clicked. So EV prevent default. All three of these functions are using that to stop the form from actually submitting, stop the page from reloading. I'm then grabbing which form are we talking about? Is it the reg form, the get form, or the add form? So the starting part of all three functions is the same. For the register, I get the email value. I'm creating an object. I'm stringifying it. I'm putting that email value inside of it, and then that's what I'm going to submit. So I have a common send function that I'm using for all three of these. The middle one has no data, but the first and the last one, they both have some data that's coming out of the form, which I put in an object, I stringify, and then I pass that as the second parameter to this send function. You can see there's data here, null here, so I'm not passing anything to my send function. Each one of them has a different endpoint. So there's a register function, and then we've got a cheese endpoint with the different methods. It's either get or post. Okay, so there's my prepare the form once the person clicks the button. And then my send function right here. Here's the endpoint, the data, the method. This is going to be the IP address for my API. So I'm passing in that endpoint, whether it's API register or API cheese. This is where it is. Now I need to start my server running. You can see inside of here, I've got a folder called client, a folder called server. The client is just this file that we're looking at right now. The server has a bunch of things inside of here. There's a middleware folder with one file. This is where I'm doing all the validation, all the work with the API keys. Data, this is right here. this is the data that I'm saving. So instead of actually talking to a database or saving things in a text file, I'm just using it in memory. Every time I start up my server, this is the data that I start with. Users, this is going to be the people who register for an API key. So we're going to give them an ID when they register. We're going to generate a unique API key. We'll take their email address and then their domain. So later on, when somebody tries to use the key, we're going to look for a match. We're going to say, okay, the API key that you provided me, does it match this value? And the website where the request is coming from, does it match this? So if both these things match, if it's localhost 5500 and it's this, okay, we're good to go. We've got a match here. And then usage, if you want to track how many times somebody has used an API key, we'd have some sort of value like this. There'd be a place where you increment the number of times the person has used it. Maybe you're only tracking the total number of times they've used it before you're billing it. Maybe it's once a month, maybe it's once a day. In this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you just sort of a daily tracking. Every time they make a request, I'm going to look and see, is there an entry for that for today's date already? If there is, we'll get the number and we'll see if it's exceeded the maximum. If not, we just increment this. When we do hit that maximum, that's when we're going to stop the person. And then this is my starting list of cheeses. All right, so that's the data file. And then we have our server.js. This is the file that's doing most of the work. This is the web server. So I've got some basics set up for Express. If you don't know how Express works, I've got a playlist on Express explaining how that all works, how that fits together. I'll put that link down in the description for you as well as the GitHub repository with all the files that I'm working with here today. So that's going to be down in the description as well. You can download that. All right, here's my users and cheeses. I'm loading that data file and I'm getting those two things out of there. And this is how I'm going to be accessing my data, is just through these two variables, users and cheeses. Both of them are arrays. I've got a health check route, which is something you should have on pretty much any API. If you just want to test if the thing's up and running, you just do a request to the base URL of the domain and you get back some sort of message. As long as the server's up and running, you should get back this JSON data. So I've got a register endpoint here. This is where we're going to create the key for the people. We've got a get cheese. This gives you the list of all the cheeses. There's the post to add one. I've also got endpoints for edit and delete. I'm just not doing anything with those right here. I'm just always sending back a, yeah, fine, it worked. But I'm not really doing anything with those. And then the listen command to start it up. So let's actually start this thing running. In my package.json, what I did was I created a script called dev. So this is to start up my server. I'm setting the port number to 4000, and I'm setting this as the maximum number of requests per day for the API. Now, you don't have to put it as an environment variable like I'm doing here, but just for this example, I wanted to show one way of doing it. This could be something that's hard-coded in your code. It could be something that's in the database. It could be something that's tied to a user account. Maybe there's different maximums for different people who are paying for different levels of access. But I just, as a blanket, made it a 25 request maximum. And then I'm using NodeMon to start up my server.js file, and every time I make a change to any of the files, it will just automatically restart it. So as I'm playing around with the code here to show you, it's going to be restarting this. So let's do this. npm run dev. And there we go. Our server is now up and running, and it's listening on port 4000. So I'm just going to shrink this down a little bit. Close this again. Okay, so this is up and running with our npm run dev. We've got that going. That means our server should be up and running, and our register and everything else should be working. Back to our web page where we're making these requests for these different endpoints. So I've got a request for a URL. the headers. If there's data that's going to be uploaded, I'm saying that it's going to be JSON data. So it's a JSON string that's being uploaded. I create my request object. I put in the method, which is either post or get. Could be put or delete or other ones, but for this example, my forms, I'm only using post and get. The headers, that's this one right here. And we're going to come back and play around with this as we start working with the API key a little bit. And there's the data, that JSON string that's in the body. We're doing our fetch call, and first thing we do, if it works, if we got a response, we're going to convert it to JSON. So my API is always returning JSON. So I'm going to extract the JSON string from the response and convert it into an actual object. And then I'm going to pass that to my success function. Or if there's a failure on the fetch or a failure here, I'm going to jump to the catch and it will call the fail method. So down here at the bottom, we've got a fail, which is just going to write out in the current form, hey, here was the error message, it didn't work. Or the success one, success, well, success, I could get an actual response that was JSON from the server, but it's reporting a problem. There could have been an issue with whatever the thing was that it was trying to do. So in my success, I need to check and see, in the data that came back, was there something called error? If there was, I'm going to call the fail function and exit from this current function because, well, something did go wrong. If I get past this point, it means I got the data and everything was good. So in my pre-formatted area that exists in each one of these forms, I'm just going to write out whatever the response was from the server. And then one other thing that I'm doing is with the register. So I'm going to show you that in just a second here. I'm going to save the API key in session storage. So my server's up and running now. I'm going to come in here with this, and let's say just steve@work.org. That's the email address that I'm going to register. There we go. Sent the response. A key was generated, and this is the data that was created. So I've got an ID, and this is my key. Now, if you're going off to somebody else's website and registering to use their API, you're not going to get necessarily an object that looks like this. What you're going to get is this. You're going to get the API key. So what I did, just to simplify this whole demo, was off inside of here in my session storage, there it is. This is my API key. And I'm using that because I'm going to use it in my other code. So I put it inside of session storage just to store it for this example. This isn't normally where I would put things. If I was building a website and I had an API key, I just have the API key in the code and would use that. Now that brings me to a security topic. With the API key, you'd think, okay, well, I've got my API key and I paste it into my JavaScript and I'm using it on my website. So everybody who's visiting my website, they're using that same key to access this API and get the data. Well, what's to stop somebody from just copying that and then putting it on their website? This is where the host starts to matter. We're telling the API website, when you register me, this is the website where I want to use my API key. I don't want to have people just steal my key and use it and hit my usage limits. So if the request is not coming from this website with this key, don't let it go through. So that's a restriction that we're going to implement on the server-side code. We're going to make sure the person's making the request with an appropriate key in the appropriate manner and coming from the right website. Without that, there's not really any way that we can manage what's going on here. All right, and there's the usage data. You can see there's today's date and count 0. It has not been used yet. Now, right now, I don't have it wired up. It's not going to be using this key yet. I have no restrictions on the server side to require a key. So I can just click on here and say, get all the cheeses. Yep, that worked. Come down here. Let's add Gouda. There we go. This Gouda was added. And now if I make another request, there it is. Okay, so this is working. our API functions. Wonderful, but we want to use this key. We want to do something with that key. So we need that string. I have temporarily stored it in session storage. Just for this example, you would just normally be pasting it into the code. I did it because I'm probably going to have multiple keys during this testing. All right, so let's come up here into our send. Now, there are different ways that we could send a key. I'm just going to actually copy that string for 1 second. There's different ways that we can send a key off to the server. But our website and the server have to be in agreement about how it's being sent. So version number 1, query string. Okay, if I'm making a request to, let's say, localhost port 4000, example, let's say that was the endpoint, maybe I'm going to have something like this. API key equals that string. So that's one way of doing it, is in the query string we can place it there. Another way of doing it is part of the URL. So HTTP localhost, like this. So you have right after the domain, this is the endpoint that you're going for, and then your API key is just displayed in the URL. Third way of doing it, which is my preference and the one that you'll see in a lot of websites, is inside the headers. So we will have a header and there'll be a name, something like this, X API key, and then the value is going to be that, our actual key. So 3 different ways that we can do it. It's just 3 different ways of bundling up that same information and sending it off to the server. So I'm going to show you or all 3 of these ways. We'll do query string 1 first. So here it is, and we're going to add this onto the end. So my endpoint is going to have that added onto it. So this is whatever the URL is, question mark API key equals, and then we'll need our API key. So let's create a variable for that. Let key equal json.stringify, and then session storage, that's where it is. And what did I call it down here? There's the name. So this is what we're getting this thing out of session storage. There we go. Now this could be undefined the first time, but it's okay. We're just adding something onto the end of here. If it says API key equals undefined, it's not a problem. It's not going to affect anything. It's not going to harm anything. It's up to the server to decide whether the string that we're sending is something worthwhile or not. Okay, so in the query string, there it is. We've saved it. We can now make a request for, let's say, get all cheeses, sending this API key. So if I click on get all cheeses here, oh, got an error. Oh, sorry, session storage. You probably noticed that as I was typing. Get item. There we go. This is what we need to get this out of session storage. Clear that off. Reload. Let's register for a new key. Oh, actually, no, we already have it, don't we? Yeah, we still have it in session storage. We don't need to register again. When I click on this, there we go. There's all the cheeses. They came back. In the network tab, right here, you can see API cheese equals, and there's question mark API key equals %22. Oh, I've got quotation marks that got saved inside of there. That's what that %22 is. Actually, you know what? This is a string already. We don't have to call json.stringify. That could be adding the quotation marks around this to say that it is absolutely a string. So let's try that without the JSON. Yeah, there we go. So now we don't have that %22. on there. So just by removing the JSON.stringify, because what we had in session storage was already a string, so we don't need to add that additional part. But there it is. In the query string, we have our key that's being sent up. So let's jump over into the server. And we've got our get, our register, and here's our get cheeses. Okay, now we're not requiring anything at all for the API key. We're not checking for an API key yet. But what I want to do is I'm going to add that in here. In my API keys file, so this is my middleware file, I have a function called genKey. This is the thing that generates that unique 30-character string. Basically, I'm using base 36. Base 36 is lowercase a to lowercase z, and then 0 to 9. 26 plus 10, that's a total of 36 characters. So it's one of these characters, and it's always going to be 30 characters long. I create an empty array that's 30 characters long, and I'm calling map. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through each one of those, and I'm going to, inside of each one of the items, call math.random times 36. So it's a number from 0 to 35. This bitwise or 0, what it does is it rounds off all the decimal parts. So this gives me just an integer with a number from 0 to 35. And then I'm converting it to a string of base 36. And then I'm joining it back together. So it's all being stuck back together. So we get a string that looks like this. So that's our key. Create user. This is the register function. This is where I create every one of the users. So I take the date stamp, the timestamp for right now, the moment where they're creating the user. I generate a key for them. I take the email address that was submitted. And here, host, this is where I get that http://localhost:5500. This thing right here. That value is coming from the request header's origin. So there is a header called origin which contains that value. So this is the http localhost 5500. That's what this value is right here. So we're saying this is the website where you are allowed to use the key that was just created. And we create an empty usage with today's date and the count is 0. All right, so we have that. I add this new user that I just created into my users array. That was the one over in the data file. So we're adding a new user like this. Validate key. This is the one that we're going to use for those cheese methods. So, hey, you want to get all the cheeses. Hey, you want to add a new cheese. Every time you do this, it's going to count as one call towards your maximum number. That's that 25 per day. Now, I'm not checking anything right now. I'm not getting the API key. This validate key function, what we're going to do is over here, every time there's one of these calls, we're going to say, you know what? Let's call the API validate key method. We're going to add this in here for all of our API calls. Because it's going to be the same check every time. It doesn't really matter what they're doing. We count it towards their limit. So every time they're going to do something, we're going to call this one function, and it's going to do all the work of checking to see, are they allowed to do this? So we get the origin. Where did this come from? Which website did this request come from? That's what this host value is going to be. The API key. Well, in this first example, we were sending it through the query string. If we look back in here, oh, okay, the get cheeses, we had that, was making the request. We need to get that value right here. So API key, if we're using the query string, we're going to be looking at rec. This is the request object. It has a property called query, and inside of that, what's the name of the thing that we're looking for? Well, API key. Back here, That's what we called it right here, API key. So in our documentation for the API, we would tell people what we want you to do is in the query string, create a value called API key and put your key there. If that's what we're telling people to do, this is what we need to do. So this is version 1 with the query string. Now I'm going to loop through my users array. That's from the data. We're getting all the users. We're going to loop through them, and we're going to check things. Okay, what do we want to check? Well, we could look at the ID, if the ID was being sent to us some way. I don't want to do that. I want to use the host. So inside of here, we need to get the host from the user. If we look in the data, this one right here, this host must match this one. This is the one that's coming on the current request. It has to match the one that's in our data. So if those two things match, and the API key right here that we just got from the query string, if that matches the one that's in the data here, if both those things match, users.find will return to us that account object, which is just one of those user objects. We will then generate a date. So this is how I'm generating the dates when the person registers. It's going to be a year, a hyphen, actually just down here in the notes you can see I'm console logging it out when the requests come in. So 2020-05-08. This is going to be the value of the date inside that usage array, which if I've got a user object here, you can see in the pop-up here, we've got usage, and there's an object inside there, date and count. So we're going to loop through this array usage, and we're going to find the number of the one that matches. So for each entry inside the usage array, if the date matches today, hey, we've got one. So the index is greater than or equal to 0, means I have a request already today. So if I have that, great. Then account usage with that index number dot count, that's the number. If it's greater than or equal to max, and that's up at the top of the file here, max I'm getting from my environment variables, which were set up in package.json when we first loaded this one right here. So 25 is my max. So I've got it here. If it exists, I'm using that number. If it doesn't, then I've hard-coded 25. Back down in here. So if they are greater than or equal to that max number, this is the response that I'm going to send. I'm going to tell them, hey, no, you've exceeded your maximum number of calls. If not, then I'm going to increment the number, and I will actually console log out good API call down here, and with that number that they're currently at, and then I call next, which will take me back to the server and run the rest of this code. So validating, I've checked it, and then we send back all the cheeses. So let's save that change. Now we should be able to get all the cheeses. And we're not allowed. So here was our response that we got back. Error 403, you're not allowed. Right here. This one, this else, is matching up with, if I shrink this down, this else matches this one. The account, there was no match for the account where the host and API key matched, and that is because we've restarted our server, so we're back to the original data. So we do have to register again before we can get this to work. All right, so we'll add that in again. Work.org, register. There's the new key. And if we look inside of application, sure enough, there's the match for the new key. In the console, yep, it saved it. And let's look at network. We can see our request. There's the request for register. That worked. Now I should be able to make a request. And it did work. So here was the request And this request had the API key in the query string, and we got back the appropriate data. And if we jump back into VS Code, there it is, good API call. On today's date, the count is 1. Now if I do a few more calls here, let's add a couple of cheeses. There's Gouda and Danish Blue. I'm doing a terrible job spelling that. I'm sure that's not the right way to spell Jarlsberg. That looks a bit better. There we go. Added. Get all the cheeses. There we have them all. And I'll click on this a couple more times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're up to 10 calls. You can see here's all those calls going through, and I'm going through my limit. And if I click a bunch more times, I should eventually, boom, max API calls exceeded. There's the request. There was the error that I hit the maximum. So this is working. So this is tracking the number of calls that are being made with that specific API key from this website. Now, just quickly to cover the other two ways of doing it, we did first one, which was with the query string. So let's just duplicate that line and comment that out. The second way of doing it was, instead of in the query string, we could make it part of the URL. So it's just something that gets added onto the end there. So I can save that, and we'll come back in here, server. Now, if you are going to use it as part of your endpoint, we don't care about it for register. That's where we're creating it. But down here for all these cheese calls, if you want to, then what we need to do is something like this. API key. That will look inside the URL itself and look for something called API key. When you've got some other value here, what you would have to do is set up another variable. And it will take the first number as the cheese, and the second one will be, or the last one, will be the API key. Just like rec.params.id would get you this one, rec.params.api key is going to give you this one. So we have to change our function here to say, now this is going to be equal to rec.params.api key. That, double check, no, all together, no underscore, no space or anything like that. There we go. That is going to be number 2. So version 2 with the URL params. So save that, validate key, we'll restart it again, back to the website, we'll have to register once again. Oh yes, okay. We don't want to add for our register right here. Because with the register we didn't say there was something else coming in, it didn't match the URL that was being requested, so we got a 404 error going back. So let's go back to here, and we'll only add this key on if, right here, if current form is equal to reg form, we don't want to add that API key on the end here. So we'll say if current form does not equal reg form, there we go. So we'll say if it's not equal to reg form, we want that whole thing, but if it is equal to reg form, we do not want to add that key onto the end. That way it doesn't get sent through, and that way it is going to match perfectly on this. Okay, one more time. There we go. Now we have a new key, and it is saved right here. Good. So our network, using it now as part of the URL. So if I clear this off, we'll just watch the requests here. So get all cheeses. There it is. We can see that it is actually showing up as part of the URL right here. And the add should work as well. There we go. And the get. All of these have that, and there's the good API calls going through. All right, so that's the second one. And the third and final one, the one that I actually use most of the time, the one that you will see most of the time, is instead of it being part of the URL, we're going to make it added to the headers. So I'm going to comment out all the rest of that. So that was number 2. Down here for the headers, we're going to do the same sort of logic. We want to add the API key to our request, but instead of it being written out as a string here, it's going to be added to the headers. So h.append, we're going to create a key called, or a header called API key, and then the value is going to be the key right here. So instead of writing it out as a query string or as part of the URL, we're putting it inside of a header. That's saved. Now, this H header could have both these things. It might be just the API key. It might be this and the API key, but it's in the request as part of the headers that are being sent up on the request. In the browser, when you're looking at requests like this, these headers right here, these are the headers that are being sent as part of the request. If there's form data, there's a body as well, but the headers, if we look inside the request headers, accept encoding, language, and so on, what we're going to do is we're just going to create our own entry here. We'll have one that is content type, application JSON, if we're uploading data, but all of our requests should have this X API key. So there will be another one inside of here called X API key. All right. Now, on the server side, how do we get the header? Well, it's doing almost the same thing. I'm going to remove this. Okay, so we've removed the API key from the URL. Now it's coming through in the headers. So inside the validate key function, down inside of here, API key version 2 was getting rec.params. Version 3, let API key equal rec.header, and then the name of the header is X API key. And that's the only change we need to make. We're getting it from the header. We know the rest of this code was working already. So now we're sending it through the headers. So let's start over again. Got a new API key. We can get all the cheese, create new cheeses. And list them again. And if we quickly go through all the requests, there we go. We finally hit our max API calls exceeded. Too many requests. And if I look in here, sure enough, when it got to 25, that's when it stopped. And that's it. That's how API keys work. That's how you could implement a very simple limiting structure so that we're just checking how many times you're allowed to use it per day. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. I'll answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.